Okay, so if you thought dirty politics and messy presidential transitions were just, a modern invention, you are in for a serious shock. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack how petty personal drama between U.S. presidents has literally shaped American history and continually threatened the stability of the entire nation. Today, we're digging into the source material to see how the peaceful transfer of power, which is basically the absolute bedrock of a functioning democracy, has been repeatedly pushed to the absolute brink by the men occupying the Oval Office. Let's take a really quick look at the agenda for today. First, we'll cover when politics gets personal. Second, reconstructing a broken nation. Third, crises caught in the middle. Fourth, betrayal and cold handoffs. And finally, modern tests of democracy. Let's dive right in. When politics gets personal, we tend to think of the Founding Fathers as this perfectly united front, right? But their early political divisions were incredibly vicious, and they really set a dangerous precedent. I mean, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were the original dream team. They drafted the Declaration of Independence, they dreamed up the future of America together, but the second they both ran for president in 1796, that friendship completely evaporated. By the 1800 election rematch, the gloves were totally off. Jefferson's supporters, including his hired attack dog James Callender, just went for blood. They literally called Adams a hideous hermaphroditical character. I mean, they were actively trying to strip the man of his dignity. Adams's team fired back, branding Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow. Jefferson ended up winning the presidency, and Adams was so incredibly upset that he snuck out of Washington, D.C. at 4 a.m. on Inauguration Day, making him the very first president to skip his successor's ceremony. Fast forward to the 1828 rematch, and things somehow got even uglier. John Quincy Adams, following right in his father's footsteps, and Andrew Jackson engaged in pure political blood sport. Jackson's camp actually accused Adams of being a pimp for the Russians. Meanwhile, Adams's camp attacked Jackson's wife, Rachel, calling her a bigamist. Tragically, Rachel died just weeks before Jackson took office. He completely blamed his political enemies for her death and vowed to never ever forgive them. When Jackson crushed Adams in the election, Adams pulled his dad's signature move and refused to attend the inauguration. This deeply personal feud permanently split the Democratic-Republican Party for good, which actually gave birth to the modern two-party system. When we look back at history, a pretty wild pattern emerges. Presidents just flat out refusing to participate in the peaceful transfer of power because of bitter rivalries. The Adams family started the trend in 1801 and 1829. Then you have Andrew Johnson in 1869 and Donald Trump over 150 years later in 2021. It's a striking reminder of how personal grudges disrupt that visual unity a democracy desperately relies on during a transition. So, the wild insults and the 4 a.m. escapes are historically entertaining, sure. But we really have to ask ourselves, what actually happens to the country when the men in charge refuse to cooperate? Because the peaceful transfer of power isn't just about taking polite photos together. It's about the literal survival of the nation's institutions. Section 2. Reconstructing a broken nation. This brings us to the post-Civil War era. The country is essentially on life support, and the president couldn't agree with his top general on how to heal it. This wasn't just political theater between Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant. It was a fundamental fight over the soul and the actual safety of the reunified country. After Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson wanted to fast-track former Confederates right back into power. General Grant, on the other hand, sided with Congress. He demanded a tougher reconstruction to protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans and keep the old Southern elite from just regaining control. Well, this disagreement went absolutely nuclear. When Johnson tried to use Grant as a pawn to bypass Congress and fire his Secretary of War, Grant completely refused. That led to a massive public war of words. By the time Grant won the presidency in 1868, the relationship was completely destroyed. Grant refused to even ride in the same carriage as Johnson. In retaliation, Johnson angrily skipped the inauguration, choosing to stay in the White House and sign meaningless documents just so he could avoid his successor. Because of this totally fractured handoff, when Grant finally took office, he had to use federal troops to aggressively enforce civil rights and fight the KKK. Alright, Section 3. Crises caught in the middle. Decades later, a new rivalry proved that a cold handoff during a national economic emergency is incredibly dangerous. As the Great Depression was just crushing the country in 1932, the outgoing and incoming presidents absolutely despised each other. FDR basically called the sitting president a fat, timid capon, which, by the way, is a castrated rooster, while Herbert Hoover called FDR a chameleon on plaid, meaning Roosevelt changed his position so much that not even a Scottish kilt could camouflage him. Think about this number for a second. 4. Back then, there was a 4-month lame duck period between the election in November and the inauguration in March. 4 entire months. The banking system was teetering on absolute collapse, and Hoover literally begged FDR to publicly support emergency economic measures just to restore some public confidence. But FDR completely refused. He didn't want to be tied to Hoover's failed policies. Hoover was absolutely furious, calling it the coldest-blooded political act ever undertaken. When presidents prioritize spite over basic coordination, the American people pay the heaviest price. Modern historians actually believe that Hoover and FDR's standoff worsened the banking panic of 1933, and we see this pattern repeat. Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower's feud over McCarthyism led to delayed intelligence briefings right in the middle of the Korean War. And in 2020, delayed transitions directly impacted the nation's early coordination on the COVID-19 response. The true cost of a bad transition is measured in tanking economies, military vulnerabilities, and massive public health crises. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Betrayal and Cold Handoffs. Sometimes the deepest hatred comes from what presidents perceive as outright betrayal by their closest peers. Take Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. These guys were genuine best friends. Teddy handpicked Taft to succeed him, fully expecting him to carry on his progressive legacy. But when Taft took office, he drifted right and fired Teddy's allies. Roosevelt was so enraged that he actually came out of retirement to run against Taft, calling him a puzzlewit with less brains than a guinea pig. Taft finally snapped and called Roosevelt a honeyfuggler. That is an amazing old-school slang term for someone who sweet-talks you while lying straight to your face. Roosevelt ended up starting a third party just to ruin Taft, which successfully handed the presidency over to Woodrow Wilson. Jumping back to Truman and Eisenhower, their feud was rooted in a deep sense of moral betrayal. During the Red Scare, Senator Joseph McCarthy was accusing government officials of harboring communists. When McCarthy targeted General George Marshall, who was a towering U.S. figure and Truman's most trusted advisor, Eisenhower stayed quiet on the campaign trail so he wouldn't alienate conservative voters. Harry Truman was so utterly disgusted by Eisenhower yielding to this paranoia for votes that he accused Ike of flat-out cowardice. Their transition was completely iced over, and Truman later wrote that Eisenhower didn't know any more about politics than a pig knows about Sunday. Now this brings us to what is arguably the darkest side of political sabotage. While Lyndon B. Johnson was desperately trying to negotiate peace in Vietnam before leaving office in 1968, Richard Nixon's campaign was secretly telling South Vietnamese leaders to stall the negotiations, promising them a much better deal if Nixon won. FBI and NSA wiretaps actually confirmed this interference. LBJ privately fumed, calling it literal treason and saying Nixon had blood on his hands. Historians believe Nixon's secret interference prolonged the Vietnam War by years, costing tens of thousands of additional lives. It is just a chilling example of political gain being prioritized over human life. Finally, Section 5, Modern Tests of Democracy. We have to remember that the peaceful transfer of power isn't just some historical trivia found in textbooks. It remains a fragile and actively tested necessity right here in our modern era. The feud between Barack Obama and Donald Trump shows how modern media just amplifies these rivalries. It escalated from tabloid conspiracies, with Trump loudly pushing the birther conspiracy, to Obama brutally roasting Trump at the 2011 Correspondents' Dinner. When Trump took office, he made it his mission to systematically dismantle Obama's legacy policies, like parts of the Affordable Care Act and the Paris Climate Accords. And it culminated in breaking decades of White House decorum when Trump refused to invite Obama for the traditional portrait unveiling. This modern tension completely boiled over during the 2020 election, leading to a full-blown constitutional crisis. Donald Trump refused to accept the election results against Joe Biden, claiming fraud and filing dozens of lawsuits. This environment directly preceded the events of January 6th at the Capitol. Ultimately, Trump boarded Air Force One and skipped the inauguration entirely, making him the first outgoing president to refuse to attend his successor's swearing-in since Andrew Johnson way back in 1869. And as we discussed earlier, this delayed transition directly impacted the nation's ability to seamlessly coordinate on the COVID-19 pandemic response. But listen, this kind of tension exists everywhere, across the political spectrum, even between close allies like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. They had severe behind-the-scenes friction. When Biden was considering his 2020 run, Obama privately doubted his campaign abilities, giving him this extremely blunt warning. Plus, Obama reportedly delayed his endorsements until Biden had practically cleared the field, which caused some very serious frustration within Biden's camp over perceived disloyalty. So, after looking at this long history of bitter feuds, this explainer leaves us with a really critical question. We've seen over and over that when presidents put their egos and their hatred above their duty to transition power smoothly, the economy suffers, wars are prolonged, and civil rights are delayed. If our democratic system relies absolutely on peaceful cooperation during these fragile handoffs, can it actually survive when personal grudges become more important than the nation itself? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see political rivals refusing to shake hands. Thanks so much for watching, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.